everyone. I am Sarah Bate. I'm the CEO for Sailor Society, but today I'm very much here as the chair for ICMA, for International Christian Maritime Association. Really lovely to see so many of you joining us here today to talk about the welfare needs of women seafarers, which is what we are hoping to talk about this afternoon, as it is here in the UK. But from looking around on the screen, I can see that there's possibly some people are seeing this as their morning if you're over in America, or evening if you're over in Asia. So lovely to see all of you, and thank you for joining us. I thought before starting the whole thing, I just thought I'd give you all a little bit of some statistics. I'm sure a lot of you are fairly familiar. That actually reminded me. Could I ask that everyone is putting their audio on mute if you're not speaking? Thank you. There we go. Thanks, everyone. So as I said, I'm going to start by just setting the scene a little bit. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this already, but out of it, did you know that 11 billion tons of goods are being transported by sea every year? And that is worth about 14 trillion US dollars. That equates to, if you're putting that together, to about 1.5 ton per person that is transported at sea every year. But yeah, and that's transported by the 1.6 million seafarers that we are relying on to transport. That's such a large part of our economy every year. But yet, out of those 1.6 million, only 2% of them are women, which is quite obviously a small number. And if you're looking and drilling into that number even further, out of those 2%, 94% of those 2% actually working in the cruise industry. So in terms of the number of women that is working in the cargo vessels and the areas that we are due to talk to mainly about today, it is a very small proportion. And that's obviously an interesting fact in itself. And I'm sure you, like I have been on many talks and calls about what can we do to change this? How can we recruit people in, etc. And that's a really interesting discussion, but that is actually not where we want to focus today. Today, we really want to spend some time to talk to you about what can we do to support that 2%? What more is it that we, because I say we as an industry, can do to really support the unique needs of the female seafarers that are out there? And we're going to be guided today by the really excellent research that's been done by Professor Helen Sampson and Dr. Iris Asio from Seafarers International Research Centre at Cardiff University, CERC. And in a minute or so, I'm going to hand over to Helen to start us off with some of that thinking. But before doing so, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a background to why is this event hosted by ICMA and the Seafarers Charity here today. And that all started by the Seafarers Charity being approached by CERC to see would they be interested in support the funding of this research, really important research, obviously. And for them, it was all about understanding what their funders' needs were and where the needs were when they were looking at funding opportunities, particularly into this important agenda point. So that's where it all started. And that's where this research, obviously the research came about, but that's where the Seafarers Charity got involved in it. Once the research was then finished, Deborah came to meet us and Tina, and they said, you know, we've got this excellent piece of research. What's the next step? What do we do now? How can we really make sure that this research is being actioned and that we're really making a difference with it? And that's where we as ICMA came in and said, this is a great opportunity to get our ICMA colleagues together and really look at what we can do. How can we now take this research to the next level and really implement some of the changes that the research is recommending, but also to keep in mind when we're planning and thinking for the future of what is it that we can be doing. So that's the background for why we've all come together and what we are trying to do. Today, we are going to first, as I said before, hear from Helen about the research. After that, I'm proposing to have a brief chat with Deborah and getting around her take on the research and the issues in general that is raised through the research. And then I'm going to hand over to some women that is operating on front line for them to talk a bit about what does this mean for them and their everyday work that they're doing with female seafarers on a daily basis. And then really, really important, I will open up the floor for us to discuss, because I think that's a really important part of today, is for all of us to have that discussion and sharing good practice, sharing thoughts, and what more can we be doing in around this really important area of work. So I think that's pretty much what we're planning and hoping to do in this next hour and 15 minutes. I'm going to now start us all off by handing over to Helen. Helen, I think, has a little presentation that will come up soon. And Helen, just so you know, you've got about 20 minutes, and then we've got quite a tight timescale. So then I might start coming in and interrupting you, Helen, after about 20 minutes to move to the next, if that's okay. Thank you. Helen, over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I would like to race through really some findings from the research. I received a very strong instruction not to get carried away and start talking about our research methods. So if you've got any interest in that, I'm afraid you just have to look at the report. I'm going to dive straight in really to the presentation. And Jason, I wonder if you could change the slide. And the next one, please. And the next one, please, Jason. So, as has already been outlined, women seafarers, we know, are in a huge minority, or in a tiny minority, I should say, in relation to working on cargo ships. And we looked at cargo ships in particular because we felt that there were specific needs that women seafarers would have over and above those needs of their male colleagues in the cargo sector, or we thought there was a possibility that they would have specific needs that may or may not be being met at the present time, and that related to their minority status. And indeed, that's what we found very strongly. So the sorts of areas that I'm going to talk about and the things that we found in encapsulated terms are that women were made to feel very unwelcome on board sometimes, not always, by colleagues, and also as a result of certain ways in which they're kind of excluded on board in a thoughtless way by companies, and that their needs aren't met. So that they, I think nobody can be any doubt as a woman on board that that this is a male environment that you are entering, and it's almost sometimes it's almost as if it's a special favor for you to sort of be there. The exceptions are being made for you, and as a result, there are some things that you definitely need, but are not provided because this really isn't your sort of world and environment. That was one of the messages that came across to us from the research, that women feel like that. There's also the fact that women are socially excluded. So they may be sort of materially excluded in certain ways, but they're also socially excluded in certain ways. And again, I'm not, when we sum up the research in this way, not meaning to imply for one moment that every single woman is socially excluded for every single voyage, by everybody on board. But in general terms, there is a social exclusion that women experience over and above the social exclusion that all seafarers experience on board. And that's the consequence of the masculine-oriented environment. So I'm going to talk briefly about jokes and pornography and how they contribute to that exclusion. There are ways in which women seafarers feel it's necessary to exclude themselves as well, to avoid gossip and to avoid harassment. I'm going to talk about that. And they do, there is a very large amount of fear, really. And this, I suppose, of all the findings, perhaps shocked me the most. I did research with women seafarers 20 years ago, and found some disappointingly similar things across time, in relation to facilities that aren't being provided and so on, that I'll come on to. But what I didn't find 20 years ago, and what surprised me in this research, was the number of accounts that we had of people who were fearful on board. That came across really, really strongly. The reason they're fearful is that because they hear about and they have experienced to different degrees sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that has consequences for them. And sometimes they feel that they're unable to report even quite serious events on board. Can we have the next slide, please, Jason? I'm going to run through some quotes from women seafarers with you, because I think this is the most powerful way for you to hear their voices, really, in terms of what they're saying. I think it's more powerful than me just summing it up. So in terms of feeling unwelcome, the sort of thing that we heard a lot of was summed up really by this rating. So she said, "I've experienced a lot of crewmates that still think that this is not a world for you, this is not an industry for you, it's always like that." I mean, some accounts that we had, male colleagues perhaps thought they were being supportive, you know, by saying, "Oh, this is a dangerous, dirty, nasty world, why are you here," kind of thing, not appreciating that even, you know, with perhaps kind intentions, their message is very, very strong to women seafarers, to get across that they shouldn't be there. And sometimes that message is coming from, of course, superior officers, senior officers. Superior is not really the right word, sorry about that. Senior officers, and then that has particular consequences. If we could have the next slide, please, Jason. One seafarer said, "My department head, he doesn't like female on board because, according to him, females on board is like a liability. He seems to dislike me. He directly told me that he doesn't like having females on board." So I don't know if you can put yourself in that seafarer's shoes and think about what it's like to be actually being supervised very closely by somebody, maybe being receiving training and mentorship from them ostensibly, but they actually don't want you on board, and they make that very clear, and they think that women don't belong on board. We'll have the next slide, please, Jason. And one woman seafarer sort of summed it up for us by saying, "You know, I have to face these people every single day. And I have to face that feeling that I'm with a group of people, a group of colleagues who actually don't want me there." And that is a horrible thing on board a ship. It's a very small crew. So to feel that you are having to smile and be nice to and friendly to and, you know, work with in a pleasant way, all these people every day, but actually really made to feel aware of how much they think that you don't belong there. You should be at home having kids, you should be doing something else, but you shouldn't be here on the ship. The sort of material ways that the organizations that actually, you know, bring women onto ships to work for them are excluding women as well. And again, this just reinforces that message, really, that you don't belong here as a woman, you are some sort of weird exception. So women talked about the PPE, for example, and the general problem was that, you know, women's sizes just weren't made available on board. So this woman seafarer explained about her shoes. The size is too big, it's men's size. And she says, "What do I expect? Even the shoes, so I have blisters on my feet on the first few months." So, you know, these things also have real consequences. So another seafarer, can we have the next slide, please, Jason? Another seafarer talked about how the gloves that she was given on board didn't fit. And so she asked if she could have gloves provided for her. And she was told, "Well, you know, I'd have to buy 10 pairs of those gloves and they cost $25 each. And you're the only person in that size. And I don't want to spend $250 on my budget." By the chief officer. So she had to work in gloves that were too big for her, which obviously has safety implications as well. We heard of boots, people being unable to have their size of Wellington boots when they're having to go and work in the ballast tanks, for example. And then it's not safe to be climbing up and down ladders in boots that are too big for you. And these issues are not being resolved by companies. And the message seems to be quite clear that, you know, you're an exception, you want to be there. It's almost as if it's to say, you know, you put up with what you've got. Also excluded in terms of provision for menstruation, and this is one of the things that we also found 20 years ago, and I find it shocking and a disgrace, really, that women seafarers still aren't having their needs met in terms of sanitary products being available on board. And you need to bear in mind that women can't always plan how long they're going to be on board, because sometimes they're asked to stay on longer. That happened a lot in COVID, of course. but it happens all the time as a regular thing. And the other thing is that, you know, even to be prepared, women were saying to us that, you know, it takes up a lot of space in your luggage to carry all this stuff on board. Some of it's, you know, depending on people's personal choices, can be quite bulky, and we found that women seafarers were sometimes taking their own PPE because it wasn't available on board, their own sanitary products. I mean, I'm amazed that they had any room in their suitcases for anything else, quite honestly. So just practically, it's very frustrating and irritating for them, and a constant reminder that, you know, that they're exceptional on board. One woman told us that in the bond store, there's chips, there's snacks, there's drink, there's a lot of other things, but there are no sanitary napkins. So you buy all these trivial things, snacks, but not sanitary napkins. And even when women, you know, because they're a bit more assertive now than they probably were 20 years ago, and some of them talked about bringing things up and asking for provision. But even when they brought it up, they were met with no help at all. So we had examples where they were met with no help at all. And I never didn't have one example where somebody said, we suggested it and it was provided, and that was the end of the story. Not one. This seafarer, I told my captain, he was also Panamanian, I said, Captain, maybe next time you'll have in the slop chest sanitary napkins, because, you know, you have two females on board. And then he was just laughing. Right, next slide, please, Jason. Somebody else brought it up in meetings, and she worked, this particular individual worked in the same company and on the same ship, small fleet really, regularly. So it wasn't that she moved away from the ship and things had changed on that ship. Nothing changed, and she brought it up several times before she gave up. There's no sanitary products, she told us, but whenever I've suggested it in meetings, they've always nodded their heads and said it's a good idea, but it's never actually taken anything any further. This has implications for anyone who's trying to provide women seafarers with welfare facilities ashore, because one of the things that's really important to stock is sanitary products for women, and maybe sometimes in a discrete part of a provision of a room, because sometimes they'll be coming with their colleagues from the ship, and for some women seafarers, they still don't feel comfortable buying personal items like that in front of their colleagues. But it isn't the case that they can always go to the shops. So it might be that the only chance they've got to get ashore is to dive into a seafarer centre, for example, quickly buy something, get back to the ship. It's not, we shouldn't assume that they can go into town and find things in towns. Next slide, please, Jason. Even bigger problem, which I shall not dwell on, but I can't emphasize to you too much really how much of a difficulty this is for women seafarers. If you just imagine for a second that when you're on a ship, you're not supposed to throw things overboard, and in any case, a lot of people would feel that that was quite the wrong thing to do, to use the ocean as a dustbin in that way. You are totally dependent on the ship arrangements for waste and waste disposal. All the waste on board ships has to be sorted, and then it goes ashore in certain categories. And if the ship doesn't comply with the regulations that require that, the ship can be fined. So, you know, you really are dependent on proper facilities being provided. We didn't find a single woman who had proper sanitary provision in terms of disposal of sanitary items on board ships, not one. So this meant that they were often wrapping things up in loads and loads and loads of packaging, afraid that their colleagues would find it when they're sorting the garbage, sometimes putting it in plastics disposal, which I'm not convinced is where it's supposed to really go, sometimes taking it ashore in their, you know, bags to try and dispose ashore. A big problem, and of course it's something that doesn't go away and recurs throughout a voyage. The next slide, please, Jason. And the lack of facilities can also cause women to have problems with their colleagues and conflict with their colleagues, because sometimes women who are not told what to do with their sanitary items, there's no instructions on board ship, generally speaking. Nobody's told them don't flush it down the toilet. But if you flush things down the toilet on a ship, you'll block up the sewage system and the pipes. And that's very unpleasant for your colleagues, because they'll then have to unblock it. And I've heard many examples over the years of women being humiliated as a result of that happening, and male colleagues coming up to them and publicly humiliating them by complaining and discussing it, and worse things that I won't go into as well. This is a fairly mild example of the sort of humiliation that can result from this lack of basic provision. As part of the meeting too, there are some troubles in the pipes. So they asked the girls in a meeting, big meeting, how do you throw your pads? Do you flush it? So this woman seafarer said, so I told them I put it in my own trash can. They asked, where? I said, of course they don't display it. It's hidden in the bathroom or somewhere. So they asked the messman too during the meeting. They're very open. Have you seen it? Do you have any problems? Really appallingly insensitive behavior and very humiliating. And totally, as I said before, unnecessary. Jason, next slide, please. That's the social exclusions. That's the sort of material exclusion, if you like, and not proper provision in various things. But there's also a social exclusion, and that's about things like sexual jokes. Sometimes I think male seafarers are almost waiting to see the reaction of women on board ship. That applies to researchers as well when we're on board, and you know, will deliberately sort of talk in a very sexualized way and make a lot of inappropriate jokes, really. In this case, the woman seafarer explained, I told him, maybe you forgot I'm female. So he just tried to laugh, and he took it as me having a bad attitude. And of course, that is what they do. They turn it back on the woman and say she hasn't got a sense of humor. You know, what's wrong with her? Then the other day, the second time, he said the same kind of joke. The next day, he's still joking. He said, okay, we'll do the joking later because Jen is here. So in the end, the seafarer actually makes it plain to everybody that they all have to behave differently because there's this woman kind of spoiling their fun on board with them. Next slide, please, Jason. And of course, there's also pornography, and sometimes that's watched in groups. So this woman seafarer talked about they want to watch those videos in public, and they'll be in a group, and I just have to set myself apart. Oftentimes, very oftentimes, they're very fond of watching those stuffs. So, you know, that really tells you about the impact of this and how women do start to exclude themselves, which I think in an environment where you're very isolated from people ashore is very unhealthy thing to do in terms of mental health. Next slide, please, Jason. Why are they keeping themselves to themselves? Well, it's not only because of pornography, it's not only because of jokes, but we also find women keep themselves to themselves because they've had experiences of harassment, and it's the only way that they can kind of protect themselves from it. Lots of examples of that. Here's one. He put his arm around me and he started playing with my ear, and I just sort of froze and thought, what's he doing? I went to my cabin and there was a knock on the door, so I opened it, and he came straight in and stuck his tongue in my mouth. In my mind, that was really clear. I haven't done anything to ask for that. But even then, I didn't say anything to anyone. You think of these people's family back home and stuff. And that was something that we heard a lot from women, that when they did experience harassment, that they actually didn't necessarily want to complain because they were afraid of the consequence for their colleagues. Next slide, please, Jason. There was another one who cornered me into this pantry. It's a different woman, but she was telling us about several examples. I was just putting my plate and he came and I couldn't go out. He was asking for a kiss or to be touched, and he was showing me his private parts already. I didn't tell anybody about it. And this woman described this particular person as one of 3 bullies on board. So she felt quite afraid and intimidated by him already. Next slide, please, Jason. And that's one reason that people, of course, don't complain as well. So it's not only that they're frightened of the consequence for their male colleagues, they're frightened of what might happen to them if they complain, because, of course, they have to carry on sailing until the matter is hopefully dealt with, but the matter may not even be dealt with. So they do have to carry on sailing with people that they've complained about. So a lot of them are not going to want to complain. I'm the type of person who does not complain as long as I can tolerate it. There are lots of seafarers, neophytes, who lost their lives at sea, you know, committed suicide or pushed in the middle of the ocean. I don't want that to happen to me, so I just keep my complaints to myself. A really strong sense of fear. Next slide, please, Jason. One senior officer tried to harass me. You can see I was absolutely spoiled for choice in terms of the examples, lots of examples to choose from. One senior officer tried to harass me. He also entered the room and then locked the door, and then he wanted to kiss me. I said no. I pushed him, and then I went to the bosun and I told him that I'll not stay there. This person wants to kiss me. They laugh at me only. They said to me, it's okay, he's still single, it's okay to kiss you. And this was really like a kick in the teeth for women seafarers who did go to their colleagues and try to get support, try to get help in dealing with the situation. Sometimes they would find that their colleagues weren't supportive at all. And you know, just, it's not really surprising because it's a very hierarchical system. All seafarers are quite afraid of losing their jobs. You know, they're probably all quite afraid of speaking out against people. So it's easier not to see, as the next example shows, please, Jason. He was an officer. I was a rating at that time. He started kissing me on the ears like that. I tried to tell him off, but I ended up getting more disappointed, feeling bad, because I thought that the other crew who saw what he did to me, but they did not do anything, they just acted like they didn't see it. I slept that night with a knife and a radio on my bedside because I was really scared at that time. I was thinking he might enter my cabin. Next slide, please, Jason. The one thing that really shocked me was the number of accounts we had of people rigging up sort of either warning systems that someone was coming to their cabin or a kind of double lock. This is an example of many, one of many. I also have a double lock inside my cabin, or I put a chair on my door so that if I'm sleeping, so that I will notice that someone's trying to open my door. At least I'm aware, at least I'm ready to defend myself. Next slide, please, Jason. So they obviously going to exclude themselves to try to, you know, stay safe. And sometimes that will mean staying away from parties and things like that, if there are parties or alcohol consumption on board. We also heard from women who talked about how, you know, they couldn't even be friends with somebody on board ship. So that, you know, obviously some decent people on board, but they couldn't be friends with them because as soon as they were friends with them, there was a huge amount of gossip. And that's something they wanted to avoid. And so they would actually keep distance from everybody. If I spend any time with any single person on board, it's all gossip. If I play FIFA with an AB, it's all, oh, they must be up to no good or sleeping together. You don't feel like you can have friends on board because it's always the gossip around, which you don't want on board, especially if you're an officer in this case. Please, next slide, Jason. Thank you. And of course, they also don't want to mislead men as well. So this is an example of that fear that, you know, things get complicated when you become friends with people. These men, once you've talked to them, they assume a lot. They assume easily. That's why I don't usually talk to them. They can only see me when I have my duty. For example, I don't join them during break time. They understand that anyway. You as a woman, me as a female on board, I have to distance myself. So there are women on board ships who don't even feel that they can socialize with their male colleagues in break times. How isolated are those women on board? How desperate are they for some human companionship when they come ashore, when they come visit the seafarers centres? Probably desperate to talk to people. Next slide, please, Jason. And the next one, please, Jason. So what provision do women say that they actually want and need then? It probably won't come as a surprise to you. I hope it doesn't after hearing some of those accounts. That one of the things that women talked about was preferring to have some personal interaction. So I know it's an issue for resources, but you know, if you compare an unstaffed facility with a staff facility, in ports, women would much prefer to have a staff facility. They talked about digital links with other women, perhaps an app that would allow them to link with other women at sea, and also the sort of more standard type app that might allow them to link with some sort of professional to have support or counselling, preferably from a woman who understood what it was like to be at sea. They talked about the importance of that. They really want products in seafarer centres that meet their needs. Now that's products relating to menstruation, but also they talked about other things like beauty products, face creams, moisturizers. Skin can get very, very dry on board ships. and souvenirs, clothing. None of these things are usually sort of aimed at women in centres. The idea that if ports could provide some sort of access to bulk disposal facilities for sanitary products, you can't always go ashore and go into a normal lavatory facility, and the bins that are available are obviously not designed to take a great big parcel of stuff. So some sort of arrangement that would allow women to take things ashore and dispose of them in a proper way. Access to facilities that are catering for women. So there's a lot of emphasis on things like football and sports like that. Women might not be in a big group. They probably don't play football or whatever. They talked about the things that, access to the things that they might use not being provided. And information really about available port-based support and facilities targeted to their needs. Now, I know that we came across some accounts of welfare providers who didn't want to single women out on board, thinking that women wouldn't want to be singled out on board. And it's true that, of course, they don't want a big fuss made, but that's not to say that they don't need to know if there are specific facilities and if there is specific provision in the welfare centre for women. It would be very useful for them to know, because they're not used to that. The other thing is that they did talk about it being important to be that they are sought out on board by, say, ship visitors, because they could have problems and they could need to talk to somebody, and it's difficult in a sort of all-male environment. And finally, what I'd just like to say is that I know it's easy if you're providing some sort of support facilities for seafarers, for any group really, that we're all in a bean counting world, and the more people are going to use something, that's often the measure that we use as a success. If a lot of people would like that, great, let's provide that. The problem for women seafarers, almost all their problems arise from the fact that they're in a minority, and they're in such a minority, and that's also why their needs are being neglected ashore as well. And I think it's really important not to assume that numbers equates to extent of need. I think that you have a small number of women seafarers who would really benefit hugely from provision, and I really think it would be a shame and disappointing and a missed opportunity, and a bit of a tragedy really for those involved if welfare providers only think of providing if there's a big cruise ship population, for example, where there are lots more women. It's a real mistake, I think, to say, oh, we only ever see 1 or 2 women a month, so there's no point in providing support for them. There's absolutely a huge need for support for them, because you're only seeing them, but imagine what their life is like on board as just those 1 or 2 women. You can do it, you can make a huge difference. And that, if we could just go to the next slide, Jason, brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I went a little bit over time.
No, that's all right, Helen. Thank you so much for that, and for the really interesting fact. And unfortunately, I don't think for any of us on this call, some of them are unfortunately not new facts, but still very interesting to bring it all together into this research. So thank you so much, Helen. As I said before, I was going to suggest that we do questions towards the end rather than straight now. Is there anyone that have any really urgent question that needs to be done now before we move on? Or are you okay that we jot down the questions for Helen now and come back to them towards the end? Is that all right with everyone? Good. I'm going to take the silence as a good. So Helen, thank you so much for all of that for now. We'll come back to you when a question comes in towards the end. I want to now move a little bit, based on all that really interesting information and research that Helen shared with us, to talk to Deborah a little bit in terms of from the Seafarers Charity. I'm sure that all of you know who Deborah Lade is from the Seafarers Charity. She's I don't want to say new anymore because you've been in post for a little while now, Deborah, but obviously the Seafarers Charity's CEO. And Deborah, I think based on all this research, it's clear, obviously, that women are often operating in a male environment, and they are a minority, and they're trying to make their own career in an environment that is set up for men. What do you think when we're looking at the next step for women? What do you think is the next thing that we need to do based on all the discussion that we've heard here today?
Thanks, Sarah. In terms of welfare provision, I think there's at least two areas that I think are really important or really obvious. I think we need to be looking potentially at recruiting more women to frontline port welfare roles. And also, you know, I think is probably really obvious to all of us here, but, you know, the role of seafarer centres in respect to stocking, selling and disposing of discreetly, you know, women's sanitary products. I think there's another issue that I think is really important, and, you know, we as charities could be lobbying for this. But in terms of safety and some of the comments that Helen talks about, you know, the PPE, ill-fitting shoes, safety on board ships is so important and taken so seriously by many that we could really push the safety element of ill-fitting PPE on women or smaller men, to be honest, as well. And this could be a lever for change in the industry as well. So those are my sort of three takeaways immediately.
Yeah, and I think I agree with all of those, Deborah. I think if I reflect on it personally as well, and maybe with my hat as Sailor Society rather than ICMA for a moment, we've really thought about, you know, what specific support can we offer women? You know, what is that specific thing? So, for example, we have launched a peer-to-peer support groups that are specifically for women, facilitated by a woman, and then open for women. And we're hoping, at the moment they're UK based, but we're hoping to expand those to make those international groups. We're also looking at hoping to set up a specific helpline that is staffed by females for females. So that's something from our point of view that we're looking at doing. I think we all need to start looking at what are those specific things that we can be doing to address some of those needs that is coming out of here. I mean, Deborah, what do you think about the culture? How do we change? Because a lot of it is the culture, isn't it? Is the culture about accepting these sort of behaviour? What do we do to change that culture? What can we as welfare providers do to change the culture, do you think?
Well, I think this webinar is a start. You know, this can be a great starting point. You know, if everyone on this webinar took 1, 2 or 3 actions away and started to, you know, promulgate the ideas around, you know, their organisation, their port, you know, having discussions to raise awareness, that would be great. And of course, this webinar, you know, really growing understanding of the issues and, you know, the key things that Iris has raised in her research are, you know, for some, they won't be at all surprising. They you know, perhaps used to, you know, dealing with the needs of female seafarers, but for others, they might be incredibly shocking. We also need to look at, you know, the unique welfare needs of women. We can't be gender neutral in this area. Women, you know, quite frankly, are biologically and often physically different, and that's got to be acknowledged, hasn't it? And I think, you know, we on this call and others, we need to really show leadership and speak up for women, in, you know, women at sea, and really see what we can do, you know, with each of our organisations. We shouldn't be shy. You know, some of these things people really don't like talking about, perhaps even in their own home, but actually this is different. This is about work. This is really making a difference to women seafarers. So we just kind of have to be really strong and forceful about it. We need to talk about these basic, fundamental and biological needs and differences. And then I think the other things, the issues around bullying, harassment, and the feeling of fear that some of these women feel. I mean, some of the, you know, reading the research in places just made me weep, and you know, some of it was shocking, and then I thought, well, actually perhaps it's really obvious and it's not surprising, because you know, there are so few females on board and it is such a male dominated industry. But yeah, we really need to ensure that male colleagues can be allies and help women in this area as well. So, you know, port chaplains to really understand that, you know, you might quietly take, you know, a woman to one side and say, do you need any specific help or assistance? Is there anything you want me to provide for you? and really trying to get men on side and acting as allies. And of course, they shouldn't be afraid to call out, their peers who aren't perhaps being the role model, support they could be for female seafarers as well. Quite frankly, we should call out unacceptable behaviour of their peers, and that's difficult to do sometimes for female seafarers on board, but there might be opportunities afterwards, perhaps, to the company. I think we know that we're already struggling to recruit female seafarers, but if this report is anything to go by, we've already said we're not going to focus on the recruitment of seafarers, but what more can shipping companies do to retain women at sea? What more can seafarer welfare providers do to retain, women at sea? It's absolutely, in my opinion, the retention of women that is the real concern here, and that's the real difference here. You can recruit hundreds of women into the industry, but if they only stay a short time because they've had one bad experience with one organisation, then we've lost them, and that might have cost the industry a lot of money to get them on board in the first place. So we've really got to try and deal with some of these issues at the core. Of course, there's brilliant companies out there who are doing really good stuff to make sure that obviously that they're recruited and then they're retained as well. So what can we do to learn from those people? Those organizations are doing really well. There's some that are looking at proactively making changes at the very beginning of the design of ships, for example. Female and there are others that are being looking at what they can do immediately now. Female only laundry times, for example, female only changing rooms, making sure that if you've got women seafarers, that you put two on the same ship or the same journey together, as opposed to splitting them through different journeys. Those are some of the sorts of ideas that we've had at the Seafarers Charity.
Yeah, no, thank you, Deborah. And I think you're absolutely right. And it's an interesting one, particularly when you're reflecting on getting the male allies. I 100% agree on that. This is not an agenda that needs to be driven just by females for females. It is an agenda that we all need to drive forward. And just like females are able to support the welfare of males, males will also be able to support some parts of females' welfare, obviously. But there is unique areas as well that I think you're right on. Thank you, Deborah. I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit to three women that are working on the front line. We've got Ruth Campbell from Mission to Seafarers, Monica During from Stella Maris over in Hamburg, and Michelle de Putte, did I pronounce that right, Michelle, from Montreal Ministry of Seafarers. I'm going to ask them to share a little bit of their experiences from working on the front line and working with female seafarers on a day-to-day basis. So Ruth, can I hand over to you to start, please?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everybody. I thought it'd be great if myself, Monica and Michelle just very briefly for a few seconds just outlined what we do and where we work in the world, because obviously I think that sort of would help give a bit of background to what we do. So my name's Ruth Campbell, and I work jointly for Mission to Seafarers and Queen Victoria Seamen's Rest. And I work as the port chaplain responsible for the Thames. And the Thames is a very diverse stretch of water. And I will visit regularly bulk carriers. I'll visit ro-ro ships, container ships, as well as cruise ships that we have on board the Thames. My introduction to chaplaincy was a bit of a baptism of fire, really. During the pandemic, we had 5 cruise ships laid up with almost 3,000 crew on board that were in our port for 9 months. And during the pandemic, I also was the lead as well for a vaccination project for seafarers. We vaccinated 42,000 seafarers, and of those 42,000, 3,817 of them were female seafarers. So during that time, I've had many conversations with female seafarers and had an opportunity to ask them about their life at sea. I'm going to hand over to Michelle now.
Hello, I'm Michelle de Putte, and I work as a chaplain with the Ministry to Seafarers in Montreal, Canada. I've been working as a chaplain here for almost 23 years, and we have in Montreal, we have cargo ships, bulk, regularly visit bulk ships, container ships, tankers, and we also have cruise ships from beginning of May to the end of October. It's our main cruise ship season. And in the years that I've been working as a chaplain, I have not seen that much change in the number of seafarers that we meet. Although I will say it seems to have increased over the past 2 years. I've seen more, especially on bulk ships, a few officers and a few more cadets. I'll hand it over to Monica.
Yes, hello everyone. I'm Monica, it's Stella Maris Hamburg. I'm the director. We run a very small but very nice center, and mainly we visit crews on board the vessels, like ship welfare visits. We are part of a bigger network of Siemens missions and Siemens centers here in Hamburg, which is also a very diverse port. Fortunately, there is also a special entity, the Seafarers Lounge, working for cruise ships, so we can mainly concentrate on cargo vessels and to see how the situation of female seafarers is on board of those. So Ruth, what are your experiences? What we can do better to support female seafarers?
Thank you. The number of female seafarers, as we've already spoken about, has not really changed over the years. And it's right to highlight some of the issues that we have done today. But I would also like to balance this, because I think it's really, really important, because there are a lot of very positive stories from female seafarers. And there are some good companies that are really looking after their female crew as well. So I think that's really, really important. You know, I have companies that they do provide sanitary products on board. If the female seafarer has to go out and purchase her own, they will reimburse her, which is absolutely fantastic. And in their bin store, they have a dedicated bin which the female seafarer can use to deposit anything that she wishes to, as far as sanitary products are concerned. So I think it's really, really important that we kind of highlight these really positive stories as well. I have 8 female crew that regularly come into London, the Port of London, into Tilbury and into London Gateway. And over the last couple of days, knowing that we have this webinar today, I made contact with all 8 of them on WhatsApp, because we frequently speak to each other. And although none of them have come across any of the instances or any of the issues that have been highlighted today, they are extremely supportive of anything that can help make a change for female seafarers. The one thing that they would like me to bring up on their behalf, and this is reoccurring, it came from 2 or 3 of them. They're all quite young women. They're sort of late 20s, early 30s, and they have a range of jobs on board, but the majority of them are officers as well. And their biggest concern as females is that when they leave the industry to go and maybe have children or get married, their biggest concern is about when they come back to their roles, you know, and how that works. So it's quite archaic. We talk about the sort of the industry being sort of behind, but they said that they're not very receptive sometimes to female seafarers returning after they've had children. And, you know, for a number of them, they have very long contracts, 9 months. And, you know, it may be that we're able to push the industry into maybe offering slightly shorter contracts for females that are returning after having children, to allow them to not be away from their children for such long periods of time, maybe 4-6 months, something like that, instead of the standard 9 months. So that was one of the things that they asked me to sort of bring up today, which I said I would do on their behalf anyway. Michelle, how about you? How are you finding things?
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out some of the things that we do in Montreal to support women seafarers. One of the things is at Christmas, when we give out our Christmas gifts to all the ships, we ask our supporters and the volunteers that make them just to make the men's gifts, because it is primarily men. But then we ourselves will go out and purchase items for the women, and we'll make up a few gifts separately for women, so that we also know what's in the gifts and can make them, you know, smaller gloves, for example, if we're giving out gloves and toques and things like that. So smaller gloves, maybe a different type of t-shirt, or different lotions or shampoos or that sort of thing. And it does mean that sometimes the women do get 2 gifts. They'll get the general one that's been given on board, because we don't always realize if it's a new ship that there are women on board. And then when we do find out, I'll go back, get one of our women's gifts and bring that to them as well. And so sometimes it does mean they get the 2 gifts, and which they do appreciate. They do enjoy getting them a little bit extra sometimes. Another thing that we do is make sure that we have a lot of gender neutral products that we sell at our Seafarers Center. So we don't just have the for men products. We have general lotions and shampoos and soaps that everybody could use, as well as making sure that we have smaller sizes of the t-shirts and things that we sell, which I think it's a benefit for everybody as well. We also make sure that when people in the winter donate jackets, we get quite a collection of jackets in the winter from that we give out to seafarers who might be ill-equipped for the Canadian winter. And we don't automatically get rid of the smaller sizes or the women's sizes of jackets that we might get, which people might assume, well, there are no women, so why would you keep them? But we always keep them aside because there might be a woman who comes in and needs a jacket as well, and so we make sure that we keep those aside. And then also in our bathroom, we have free feminine hygiene products available, which we make sure that they're replenished when needed, and anybody can take them for free. And so those are just a few of the things that we provide for our female seafarers.
Yeah, what I see here in Hamburg is that those female seafarers that we meet on board, or also those who are already working on land now, they are usually really tough persons, and they are getting into that job because it's a purpose for them, so to make a career out of it. And so I'm always having big respect for those. What I also liked especially about Helen's presentation is what can we do to achieve just a change of the culture? And there are little things we can do. We mostly do ship welfare visits, and since the number of female seafarers is so small and we always only meet part of the crew, we try to make sure that we carefully try to find out if there is a female on board, not going around, oh, do you have a female seafarer, but just like asking, oh, have you ever sailed with a female seafarer or so that we then can try to build up a connection and to meet these female seafarers. I see small changes in the culture, for example, that the MLC, if I understand it correctly, now includes that they have to be PPE appropriate sizes for females. So they have the right for those to ask for them and to get them. But I also looked around our different seafarer centers here in the port of Hamburg, and those who support cruise ships, it's totally normal that they were all hygiene products. But in the other seafarer centers, it's always like, oh yeah, mostly are men, and we have some free products in the bathrooms. But I think it is a change to have them visible on the shelf with the stuff that can be bought, so that also the male seafarers realize, oh, there are females and it's normal, and these are their needs. What I also find helpful is to have a variety of port chaplains, female and male, both sides, young and old, so you can really be accessible for everybody. And I especially like the idea, I think Deborah mentioned that, to have female helplines, so that you can really be sure that you end up talking to a female if you want to do that. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, we found that in a number of our ship visits, we were missing female seafarers that were on board. Maybe they were working at the time, and we just sort of boarded and maybe chatted to the person on watch at the top of the gangway. So we got involved with the agents and asked that they forward to us crew lists every time crew come in. So that gives us an opportunity to scan the crew list and to check for any females that are on board, and to ensure that we sort of target those ships and make sure we go and visit them. I'm all for more female female chaplains and more female ship visitors. And maybe if we can't manage to sort of fund all these, and there's maybe not such a big uptake for female chaplaincy. So I would love to see more kind of females maybe earmarked in your different ports, that if a female comes in, they can go on board and sort of have some one-to-one time with them. I try where possible to either take them out for lunch if there's time, or, you know, sometimes they want things like their nails doing, so I will go along with them, as a friend would go along with them. And this gives an open, private time when they can share how they're feeling or if there's anything that they need. But, you know, we've talked about some really positive things, you know, and I sort of balance that with companies that are fantastic. But, you know, we do come across female seafarers that maybe need something like the morning after pill. So again, this is something that is really important, that we have females in the port that can go on board and can assist a female seafarer with things like this, which, you know, I'm sure they feel far more comfortable spending time with us. So yeah, so I think it's just about the whole port working together, the Seafarers Centre speaking to me if there's anything they see, the agents sending me crew lists, you know, and just then allowing time for a female seafarer to spend time with a female ship visitor or port chaplain. And, you know, most of the time it's hilarious, it's fantastic. I mean, if I hear a female seafarer when I go on board the ship, it doesn't matter where they're from in the world, you kind of have this involuntary screaming thing and running towards each other and hugging. So, you know, maybe it's been months since they've seen a female. So it's lovely just to hang out with them and spend a little bit of time with them and do something, because I think in their boiler suits, it's quite masculine. And so I think it's fantastic for them to, you know, I've taken them to, they've asked to have their hair done, you know, and little things like this that we don't really think about. You know, the men sort of sit there and they shave their heads and do each other's hair and things like that. So to be able to take them and, you know, go and have their hair done, or I spoke about nails, or go shopping. They love going to the shopping centres, but so do the men, I guess. But you know, they love going shopping and things like that. So yeah. I think we're out of time now, aren't we?
I just want to add one last
sorry.
thing very, very quickly. What I think we have to make sure for all people working in seafarer centers or going on board, that we know the complaint procedures. So if they are encountering harassment or so that we can tell them, see, this is the usual procedure, what you should be able to do. I know it's a big step, and I don't know if they are really able, because it means lots of fear to follow on those, but to know about them, and also to know maybe about local helplines or hotlines who can help them in cases of sexual harassment.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica and Ruth and Michelle. Really, really interesting and useful things to be brought forward and added to the thinking that Helen started us all off on. So a huge thank you to all of you. That kind of brings us at the moment to that point where we haven't got any more that we're going to talk about, but now is really the opportunity for you to come in, everyone there on this conference or call, for you to raise your questions or your comments. So I'm going to start by just saying, is there any questions to any of the speakers so far that you would like to take? If you could put your hand up, I can see it, I think, Jason, right? Yes, so we got Rebecca Newdick. That's the first one I saw. Can I? There you go. Thank you, Rebecca.
Hi. Yeah, it wasn't really a question. I just wanted to thank Helen and Iris for the research in the first place, but also it was really eloquently put, and I'll probably get what she said wrong, but when Helen said that we shouldn't equate numbers to the extent of need, and that's something that I've actually really wanted the words to explain, because, you know, with the work that I'm from Safer Waves, and with the work that we do sometimes get this, well, it doesn't really affect that many people. Is it worth bringing in a whole reporting system or a whole this or a whole that? But the thing is, it affects those individuals so much. That the extent of need perhaps needs to be measured in a slightly different way. Yeah, and I just wanted to say thank you for giving me those words for the future.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Rebecca. I agree with all that. I saw Ruth's hand up before as well. Ruth, are your hand still up? And then I've got Rebecca, and then I got Paulina after that. But Ruth, obviously, we've heard where you're from before, but can I just ask for any future questions? If you could introduce yourself and where you're from, that would be really helpful for the rest of us. Ruth, first to you there.
So I was just going to ask Helen quickly, out of the number of people that you spoke to, what was their backgrounds? How many were cargo ships? And I just wondered what the breakdown was, as in where the females were from.
You'd need to refer to the report, and all the details are there. So I can only give you a broad brush, okay, because I haven't got all those figures in my head. But in terms of the cargo sector, we didn't include women from the cruise sector, but we did have, I think, one person working on a super yacht as a deckhand, and in the galley we had somebody working we had people working on other unusual ships, perhaps, that would do more port trade, like I'll give you an example of the kinds of ships, but like tugs and dredgers and things like that. But mostly we had women working on cargo ships. We had ratings as well as officers. I mean, when I did this research 20 years ago, it's very hard to find Asian ratings, for example. We had ratings from Asia as well as officers from Asia. We had a good distribution of nationalities, including British seafarers. And we did interviews, informal interviews, semi-structured interviews with 30 women. So the stories that we got were from 30 different women. And I was very pleased to hear that you've got a company that does sanitary disposal properly.
I was just going to say, because if there's one sector that I spend most of my time dealing with sexual harassment on board with female seafarers is on cruise ships, and it is absolutely rife on there. And not a cruise ship does not come in, and I do not have one instance. Every time they come in, there's something happening. So obviously there's greater number of people, so I understand there's going to be a greater number of issues. But yeah, I mean, the cruise sector is one that definitely needs looking at, and there needs to be targeted female visitors and chaplains that can go on board there.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. And I think that might be one where we leave with Helen for consideration for the future. But Ruth, just so you know, that's very much the message I've heard back as well. Paulina, can I ask that you introduce where you're from, Paulina, first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, thank you. I'm Paulina Moore from Dalhousie University in Canada. I'm a CERC Nippon Foundation Fellow as well. Thank you so much, Helen, for the presentation. It's really harrowing to hear some of the stories. I'm just thinking about thinking of it as a chicken and an egg situation in terms of in the context of recruiting and retaining women to this industry. What sort of measurements would you suggest taking to mitigate against sort of some of the issues you mentioned in terms of to be able to recruit more women, but also to address the existing problems they raised?
I think can't actually see Helen. Helen, are you still there? Yes, there's Helen down there. Helen, are you okay to answer that?
I'm sorry, I got booted out and back in, so I didn't hear Paulina's question.
Can I comment, Sarah?
Yes, absolutely, Deborah.
I really think recruitment is something that obviously is up for industry to deal with, really, but we need to talk about how we can service the welfare needs through the seafarer centres and through those that can come into connection, make connections with the women on board, and ensure that we can help them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Paulina, I think it's Helen. No, Helen, sorry, you're moving around on my screen. She's still there. I agree with you, Deborah. I mean, Helen, Paulina, do you want to ask the Helen question mainly around the retention again? Because I agree with Deborah, the recruitment is a totally new, bigger picture that we're hoping to stay a little bit away from on this conference at the moment.
No problem. Yeah, it is a big issue, isn't it? Well, in general, I mean, it's always a conversation about working conditions, but there are obviously all the issues that are mentioned in the report relating to specifically to women. I'm just asking, what sort of measurements would you suggest taking to mitigate against these issues? in the context of retention. And, you know, again, looking at it as a chicken and egg situation, like if you create an environment where it's possible for them to feel more comfortable in the working environment, also addressing something that's already happened.
I think retention is really important. I must say that without exception, all the women seafarers that I've met have been extraordinary people. And one of the reasons for that is not just that, you know, everyone's extraordinary in their own way. It's because it takes a particular kind of person, I think, to choose to go into an industry like that. It takes a particular kind of person to decide to be a seafarer, to be honest. And I think when you are at sea, you do become very aware of your qualities and limitations. And if you're able to stay at sea alone, and for women seafarers, that's, you know, even more emphasized than for male seafarers, then I think you know, you become quite a confident, self-contained person, probably somebody who gets on with other people pretty well. And, you know, and so when you meet women seafarers, they are, you know, pretty terrific role models. But of course, as it, you know, it shouldn't really be a situation that it's only exceptional women with those sorts of qualities that can stay at sea. And I have never done a project, and it'd be very interesting to do it, with women seafarers who've left. Because if you're thinking that the accounts that I'm giving are not sufficiently sort of emphasizing the positives, then I suspect that actually, you know, we're missing out a whole load of real problems that women face that make them leave the sea, because we don't generally get to talk to those women. So the kind of, you know, the horror stories, as much as they are horror stories that we heard in our research, are nothing, I think, to the things that cause women to leave the sea. And it's really important to address some of these issues, but some of them are really, really difficult and intractable. But I think in terms of creating the structures, making it clear that women belong at sea. So just, you know, the signals that you get from there not being PPE for women, there not being menstrual products for women, these are all the really wrong signals. These all emphasize how women, you know, they're not really meant to be there. And I think the more that you can actually change that, the structures, you can't necessarily change the individuals straight away, but that will come over time, you know, as people get more and more used to the idea that women are employed. And I think the most tricky thing is actually been mentioned about, you know, what should be, how do you deal with behavior that is inappropriate to protect women, but at the same time, not making it dangerous for them, to understanding that it's not a simple thing to just go and make a complaint, but understanding that it's much more complicated than that. Because I think for a lot of women, you could put all the procedures in that you know that you want and should, but they probably wouldn't complain because of all these difficult issues. So maybe thinking about.
Helen. Sorry, Helen, to interrupt you a little bit there. I'm just conscious of time, and we only got a couple more minutes, and we've still got about 4 or so questions. So I'm going to ask if we can be a little bit swift with some of the questions and answers on it. And we do have some on the chat as well. So next, Lee Clark.
Hello there, my name's Lee Clark, I'm from Maritime. We have a cadet program, and one of the fundamental issues that we have, and in my previous role as head of cadet training for a large shipping company, it's the nautical colleges where we also fail. This is the starting point to anyone entering in our industry that goes to sea. And what we're seeing is a very disjointed connection between the support that's offered at one college or the other. And certainly if you see what's happening in America at the moment at the nautical colleges over there is fundamental issues, and we're losing a lot of talent at the very start. You know, sometimes the classrooms are 20 to 25 male, 1 female, and the deport, you know, it's really quite an issue there. So even at the base level at nautical colleges, the support that's needed there is crucial as well.
So it's a matter of starting that support in specific at an earlier stage to really
absolutely
look at that.
If you get that support right at the nautical college level, at their cadet level, we're building a stronger and more supported seafarer.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, Lee, that's really interesting. Chris Horton.
Hi, sorry, got lost my button. Apart from sort of feeling profoundly depressed by Helen's research, I mean, I've read the paper and it really is depressing stuff. But the point I'd like to make is I myself, a former seafarer, and I worked on cruise ships for 8 years. Well, you know, decades and decades ago. Now, either it wasn't happening to the same extent then, or it was underreported, or I just didn't know and was oblivious. But I don't recall the same degree of distress in those days that we're seeing today. Now, and I'm just wondering whether this is reflecting a societal move. It's a general coarseness of society. It's a coarseness of behavior. It's a coarseness and an acceptance of behaviors that we just didn't accept in days gone by. And we see it in social media all the time with trolling, and it's not restricted to this industry. It's profoundly depressing. And I would just like to echo Lee's comments that we surely must be working at an earlier stage. We must be working at an earlier intervention to try and convince people that the behaviors that are being exhibited are just utterly unacceptable. On the practical logistical front, I fail to see why we're not legislating for adequate facilities for women at sea. I don't know why there's a block there. We can legislate for that sort of the practical aspects that have been well described here, and that should be legislated for, and it should be a statutory matter. So I don't know. I think I'm left nonplussed, but we mustn't stop working, I suppose.
No, and Chris, I think your comments are heard loud and clear, and I think many are agreeing with you on it. Just out of reflection on that, and it's been really fascinating to see from Sailor Society point, we started to engage with cadets on a much more increased level for the last 2 years, working with them directly at that stage, looking at their welfare and their well-being at that stage, setting up expectations of what is it like to go at sea. And this year we're going to do one of the sessions is specifically around female and what is it like to be a female at sea. So starting at that level is a really interesting one, and one that I absolutely agree with you, both Chris and Lee, on your thoughts around. So thank you for those. I'm conscious that at the moment it is past. I still see the hands and I'm going to go there, but I'm conscious that we are past leaving time and some of you might need to drop off. And if you do, I will come back and say, if you do, then it'd be really lovely to see you here. I hope that you still stay on maybe 5 more minutes and then we'll try to close it down here. But if you do need to go, a huge thank you to you for joining us here today. So on that note, Susanna, your question, but let's try to be 1 minute each, guys, if that's okay.
Thank you, and I'll try to make it brief. Susanne Jespersen from Global Maritime Forum. I just wanted to thank you so much for doing this, and then also wanted to share that we have a project at the moment where we'll actually next week release a report that describes what we found to be the key pain point for women at sea, based on interviews with 115 women seafarers. And this is used for us to co-design measures and solutions to each of these 15, and most of them were actually also covered in this study. So I'm pleased to see that we are very much aligned, and I'm sort of looking forward to finding other ways in which to work together across the industry to address some of these really important and distressing issues. And we need to all work together to make change happen. So well, that was it. But thank you.
Thank you, Susanna. Thank you. And look forward to see the research next week as well. It's good to see and hear that there's some overlapping areas on it as well. So thank you. Right. Oh gosh, the more I'm going through, the more hands I'm seeing. And I also have a number on the chat. So I'm going to say that I've got 4 more and then that's it. So I've got Sibusio, Morgane and Ruth and Colin, and then I'm going to call it a stop. And then I'm going to suggest for those of you that have submitted tasks on the chat line that maybe I can take those away and we can circulate those afterwards. Deborah, do you think that would be okay, that we can get some of those answers that I've had and we circulate to those back afterwards? So thank you. Sibusio, 1 minute. Oh, you still there? Yeah.
Hi. Is that me?
Yes, that's you. Sorry if I pronounced your name totally wrong. Who's you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Just quickly, my name is Busiso Rantwabe. I'm the manager for OHS and Maritime Welfare, the South African Maritime Safety Authority. Yeah, very interesting discussion today. Last year in November, we held a seminar which we call Gender-Based Violence, which we spoke about sexual harassment, sexual assault, and things that came out is very interesting that women seafarers are facing similar issues all over the world. It was very shocking, and a number of the seafarers on the panel actually came out to say they've actually been sexually assaulted, sexually harassed, discrimination. I don't even want to go there. So we've submitted, just in the interest of time, we've submitted a paper to the upcoming MSc. If you are interested, MSc 107/info.16. We've also have a video of the seminar, a link to the video of the seminar if anyone is interested. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you so much. And maybe what we can do is to circulate some of these excellent research that is coming back and circulate it to the group here afterwards. I think that would be helpful. So thank you. Ruth.
Mine's just more of a comment, really, that where there is sexual harassment, we need to be able to do more to, there needs to be consequences for the company and possibly for the seafarer. Very often the person removed from the vessel is the person the female that's been sexually harassed. And so we remove her, send her home, and there's no repercussions for necessarily for the crew members involved or member involved, or for the company either. So it was just a comment, really, that we need to have more that, you know, scares them a little bit, because at the moment they just remove them from the vessel and that's it.
No, agree, Ruth. Thank you. Good point. And final comment on here, Colin.
Hello, yeah. Hi from Ireland, and I've been a chaplain for 17 years with the Seafarers Christian Friends Society, and been on thousands of ships. And yeah, the cruise ships and the cargo ships, there's very different. But I really I was agreeing with the point made about starting at the maritime schools. But I'm not sure, quite a lot of the staff on board the passenger ships haven't been to maritime schools. They may just be hotel staff. So that is something to be looked at as well. What are the cruise line companies doing? Also starting at the start of the maritime schools, but also at the end line, meeting chaplains and how to change the culture. We're competing with, you know, we provide them with internet, and now they all download so many things and all this online material, and that is shaping their mindset. So it's like we're battling against many of the things they're watching, and that links in with the pornography. So one of the things we encourage is faith communities on board. We call it the Church on the Oceans. And our team in SCFS in the Philippines, they do an active training, Church on the Oceans. So it's amazing whenever there's a small group of people on board who are have this culture of honor, let's say, on board. So that's something that I just wanted to share as well. Thank you so much. It's been very helpful to listen and to think about it.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you for your input there as well. There's, I feel a bit rude closing off because this is a really interesting and useful conversation. I wish we could continue. We should have thought that this conversation could go a bit further when we did the planning of it, but I don't want to take up more of your time for now. I see all the comments that come through in the meeting chat as well. So what I suggest is that what we do, we will circulate obviously after this the presentation from Helen, but also any other key documents that we talked about here, we can circulate those as well. And for those who have posted a question in the chat, we'll make sure that we get the answer and circulate the answers to those as well, to everyone on this call. So I hope you found that there's been a useful and interesting afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world, and that we've got a lot of things to think about, or what we can now be doing different. What can we as welfare providers do more of? Or how can we change some of our own operations, our own behaviours, etc., to better support the female seafarers? I'm just going to quickly go. Deborah, do you have any last sort of key takeaways from your end?
I just think, to emphasise what Helen said earlier, actually, these are very strong, brave women on board. And, you know, we owe it to them. You know, they're really sort of going out for female seafarers everywhere, forging a path, and everything that the Maritime Welfare Charities can do to support those women on board is really appreciated. And the more we can do, the better. And just thank you for everything that you're already doing. And let's up the ante and support more female seafarers wherever we can.
Absolutely, absolutely. Big thank you to all of you. Special thank you to Helen, obviously, and the women that were stepping forward in their panels, and to Deborah, and to Jason, who's been driving the techniques behind of it. So thank you so much to all of you, and hopefully see you in a different shape sometime soon. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you, Sarah, too. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.